Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our study of Revelation. Recall last week we covered chapter 1 of John's version of the book of Revelation, which ended with one who died on the cross speaking to him, telling John to write down what you have seen as a message to the 7 churches. Today's lesson focuses on those 7 churches. Most scholars teach they are real congregations at the author's time. They seem to represent a diversity of the southern province called Asia at the time. He gives the particulars for each church, but declares at the end of each that the message is to all churches. These letters have certain things in common. 1, it is addressed to the angels of a church. And 2, it names the city of the church. 3, the standard prophetic type message of particulars to each church is given. There is affirmation of their Christianity with sometimes some ethical comments made and warnings. 5, there's a phrase in all of them, I know, which is a divine acknowledgement to each congregation, and it often involves threats or reassurance statements. 6, the body of each is composed of a praise or blame, or both threats and rewards. Only 2, the church at Smyrna and Philadelphia, seem to receive unqualified praise. There is some praise in some of the others, but not unqualified. 7, there is a call to attention and obedience with the command, hear, which meant in its day and time, understand and obey. It is always a call to action, not just hearing or listening. Works are an important concept in Revelation when we look at the book as a whole, much like James from that standpoint, as is repentance. John connects works to, or its lack of, to the eschatological promise that's going to be made, a point so often missed, scholars tell us. 8, finally, there is an eschatological promise to those who conquer, meaning those who overcome the obstacles facing them for being Christians and sustain their faith to the very end, even at the face of death. They still exercise their faith. As one scholar says, when you look at the message to the 7 churches, you look at Revelation as a whole, this is not milquetoast theology. In these chapters 2 and 3, we find the message to the 7 churches. I will focus my comments on what scholars add to those comments to help us relate to each church's situation. Dr. Eugene Boring at Texas Christian University and Dr. Bruce Metzner at Princeton says we need to appreciate the variations in tribulation that these churches are facing. All of these places are still present today in what would be Turkey, but some underwent name changes when that area came under Islamic rule 1,000 years ago. Ephesus is the first church addressed. That city was the principal political, economic, religious, and cultural center of the whole region, the whole province, with an estimated population at the time of about 250,000. Remember, these numbers seem high to us, but this is pre-Black Death, folks, and so the Black Death, which occurred much later, had a big impact. This city had a major harbor and was the main land water sea route for involving major commerce and a hub for trade. The population and culture was cosmopolitan because of that seafaring traffic. All religions essentially of that part of the world were present. The seventh wonder of the world at the time, the Temple of Diana, or Artemis, the Greek and Roman Greek and Roman theology. That temple was twice the size of an American football stadium today and had 100 columns. It had at least 6 temples dedicated to the Roman emperor as God. It was also the founding city of Christianity for the province of Asia, the center of Paul's ministry, and still had a functioning missionary center of some sort, or school of some sort, in the 90s, based on some things that have been found. It was a must stop for various sects of Christianity, besides the Orthodox sect, as we might think of it. And so these people encountered lots of variations in religious Christian philosophy that came through, in addition to whatever conflict was going on with pagan religions and with Judaism. One of these sects that's mentioned there in that section is the Nicolaitans. John clearly labels them as heretics. Here in Ephesus, there was a rite that occurred against Christians specifically, that's been reported in history, and the comments associated with it were Christians are bad for business. They received both praise and condemnation in this revelation because they have abandoned their first love, which seemed to have been, most scholars think, is the missionary concept, and gone underground in hiding and have a system of proof test in order to let anyone in. And that doesn't set well with John and his source. Smyrna is the second city that's mentioned. That church is located about also on the coast, but about 35 miles north of Ephesus, with a population at the time of approximately 100,000. It had been a great city in antiquities, even greater than Ephesus, a commercial hub competing with Ephesus. It was a center for emperor worship from the beginning, and was very loyal to Rome, holding major festivals and had temples and rituals to honor the emperor. Historians report that refusal to worship the emperor there was strongly persecuted. Conflict with Jews occurred also, as with pagans in general. Smyrna only received some accommodation, but no condemnation. Their property is, their poverty is cited as a major thing here, and historians note that quite often. Scholars suggest they had likely experienced strong economic reversals due to their faith, with loss of jobs, confiscation of property, vandalism of their property, boycotting their businesses, and general economic deprivation because they were Christians. The Jewish statement here, scholars warn, several of them warn, should not be taken as anti-Semitic, which it often is. Instead, it's not a racial, in a racial context at all. It's strictly in a religious conflict. The Jews were likely not practicing, in other words, they're basically being criticized for not practicing what they believe, is kind of the idea, and instead seem to be more interested in not offending pagans and others for economic gain. Pergamon is the third church mentioned and is located 50 miles northwest of Smyrna, and is a city also of approximately 100,000. It later became the Roman capital of Asia, but was not at this time. It was renowned for its great temples and altars to pagan gods. The immense temple of Zeus was located there, on the hills or near there anyway, where there was constant animal sacrifice occurring, filling the valley constantly with smoke. You could always tell if one worshipped there because the smelling was on their clothes, odor was on their clothes when they went anywhere else. It also had the center of worship for the god of healing, which involves the modern day caduceus. John called them, however, the personification of evil, the symbols of Satan, the great snake. Hostility towards the church in Pergamon were considered especially strong and vicious, scholars report. This church had major conflicts with the Nicolaitans. And the Nicolaitans, by the way, were Christians. They just espoused a different version of Christianity, quite different, especially lax apparently in sexual mores, and they also attended the pagan temples and took meat sacrifices there, which we learned about in Corinthians. In other words, they would consume the meat sacrificed to idols in the temples, not in necessarily their place of worship, but they would go to these other places. It appears no other meat source actually, though, was sold or allowed to be sold in this area at the time, except that was sacrificed at the temples. This sect believed Christian sacrifice also gave them extreme freedoms, essentially to do almost anything they wished. And that was in direct conflict with Orthodox Christianity of the time. The last church in chapter 2 that's mentioned is Thyatira, located about 45 miles southeast of Pergamon, on the Pergamon to Sardis Road. It was an industrial and commercial center with many trade guilds, very skilled craftsmen in the area. These guilds were somewhat like our modern trade unions, but had elements of pagan religious connections tied in with them. They all swore allegiance also to the emperor as their Lord and God. Thus Christians were left out and thus unable to be gilded, resulting in either them not being allowed to practice their trade, or if they did it all, at a much lower value. A particular problem these Christians encountered also was from faith associated with a woman Christian espousing some other belief or some other aspect of belief that John here refers to as being or equating her with Jezebel of the Old Testament. She seems to be teaching a conflicting philosophy within Christianity, and therefore this church is condemned for, I guess, maybe in part allowing that to happen. Chapter 3 starts with the Church of Sardis. This is in a community of about 75,000 located at a crossroads where 5 major roads in that region come together. It's about 40 miles southeast of Thyatira. It had been an ancient regional capital in about 600 BC and was known as a great citadel, but both the Persians and the Romans captured it, essentially because the people were so confident of natural defense that they didn't properly defend it with men. It has sustained major damage also from earthquakes, with a major earthquake in AD 17. There is still much that essentially almost destroyed it, but there was a lot of wealth there and they were able to rebuild. The church existed, however, in name only. They did not practice the Orthodox Christian life very well. They are condemned here as a dead church that needs to wake up, repent, and practice God's will for themselves if they expect to receive the eschatological promise. The church at Philadelphia is the next church, and located about 30 miles or so to the southeast of Sardis. This is a young city, a couple of centuries old by that time, but that's very young compared to the rest of these cities. And it sits in a very hot earthquake zone. It has been badly damaged, both in the AD 17 earthquake, and then it had some of its own earthquakes as well, and was completely destroyed in that AD 17 one. But it was rebuilt. The church, historians claim, was small and poor and harassed by pagans and Jews and other religious sects that came through. It needed to be more active in spreading the gospel. It essentially operated almost underground, scholars tell us, which it was hindered especially by the local synagogues. Apparently there's pretty good evidence of that now. John labeled the synagogues there the synagogues of Satan. Exactly why, we don't know, but scholars speculate they placed so much pressure on this small Christian group that was there, not allowing them to do much missionary work. There is evidence of Christians being excommunicated from the synagogues there in the late 1st century AD. However, like Sardis, Philadelphia receives unqualified praise and a promise to be protected from the hour of trial. The final church is Laodicea. One evangelist by this one is one of those churches that was actually either founded or at least visited by Paul, along with Colossae, which the book of Colossians addresses. This was a large, wealthy commercial city on the main road about 40 miles southeast of Philadelphia. It was situated in a very long, wide, very agriculturally fertile valley. And this would be also, when we think, been giving you the directions from one city to the next. Well, in width, this is due east of Ephesus, where we started, and is approximately 100 miles away. This valley was especially known for the raven black wool produced in the region, and still, even to this day, that is one of the things that's produced in that area. It too experienced a major earthquake, one essentially destroying it as late as 60 AD, but it had sufficient wealth to recover rapidly on its own and refused to accept any outside aid from Rome, wanting to maintain as much distance as it could from Rome. But the church there was spiritually in poor health. Its members apparently relied on their financial wealth and did not practice very much in practicing what they preached. They didn't do much missionary work, and so they received the most severe condemnation of any of these 7 churches. They're basically lukewarm, was what's indicated, and several strong statements made as this is offensive to God. But rather they be cold or hot, not lukewarm. What all else they were doing to be unsettling, we don't know. It's not been said. So that gives you some idea of some of the, in addition to what's there in Revelation, of some of the setting of what these Christians would have been facing in their day-to-day life at these 7 churches. I hope you have a good week, and we'll see you next week.